The bikers target a visually impaired veteran's daughter until she makes a call that transforms everything. The tires of the old Buick crunched against the gravel as it entered the parking lot of the Blue Jay Diner, a quaint roadside establishment just off Route 41 in Indiana. This was a type of place that had remained largely unchanged since the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, faded Coca-Cola advertisements, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a tune in years. Inside, the air was filled with familiar aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. A couple of truck drivers sat hunched over their meals at the counter, while a waitress refilled a man's coffee mug without needing to ask. An elderly couple leaned in to whisper across from one another in a cozy booth. It was a kind of morning when no one was in a hurry, except for a group of bikers by the window who had lingered long enough to leave a mess of empty plates and spilled ketchup on their table. The bell above the door jingled as Lorraine stepped inside, guiding her father by the arm. She was 24, tall, with a quiet strength in her demeanor that stemmed from years of being his eyes in a world that wasn't always gentle. Her father, Daniel Briggs, walked cautiously beside her, his grip firm yet trusting. He had lost his sight 6 years prior in Afghanistan due to an IED explosion that took more than just his vision, but he never allowed it to diminish his spirit. He still carried himself like a Marine, head held high and shoulders squared, despite the cane that tapped softly against the floor as he moved. "Right here, Dad," Lorraine said, directing him toward an empty booth near the jukebox. He nodded, feeling for the edge of the seat before lowering himself down. Lorraine slid in across from him and picked up the menu, even though they didn't need it. They had dined here many times before, and he always ordered the same: black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, and a side of bacon. She preferred pancakes, smothering them in syrup until they barely resembled food. "Smells busy today," Daniel muttered, tilting his head slightly to listen. Lorraine glanced around at a few tables. Nothing unusual. He smiled, as he always did when she tried to ease his discomfort. He could hear the clatter of dishes, the scrape of forks against plates, and the low hum of conversations. He didn't need sight to gauge the atmosphere. A waitress approached, a woman in her late 50s with weary eyes and a warm smile. "Well, if it isn't my favorite duo." "The usual?" Lorraine asked, returning the menus. The waitress jotted down their orders and poured Daniel's coffee before moving away. Across the diner, the bikers' conversation grew louder, deep, rumbling voices with occasional bursts of laughter that felt a bit forced. At first, Lorraine didn't think much of it. Bikers often passed through, stopping for a meal before hitting the road again. Some were courteous, while others were not, but something about this particular group fell off. She could sense it before she could articulate it. A shift in the atmosphere, as if the patrons at nearby tables suddenly found their food more interesting than the room around them. A waitress hesitated before approaching their table, then turned back toward the kitchen. It wasn't fear precisely, just a reluctance to engage. That's when she heard the first taunt. "Look at this one," a voice sneered. "Got herself a seeing-eyed daughter." Lorraine stiffened, while Daniel continued to stir his coffee, his expression unreadable. Another voice chimed in, "Ain't that sweet? Bet she even ties his shoes for him." Lorraine's hands clenched under the table, but she didn't respond. Not yet. The tension in the air was palpable, but for now, she bit her tongue. She concentrated on her coffee, willing herself to ignore the jeers coming from across the diner. The last thing she wanted was to create a scene, especially with her father right there. Yet the laughter, the kind that masks cruelty as humor, persisted. One of the bikers, a man with a thick beard and a sleeveless leather vest, leaned back in his chair, his boots resting on the empty seat across from him. His beer bottle, likely his third or fourth, dangled lazily from his fingers as he leaned toward his friend, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's guiding him or walking him around like a lost puppy." Laughter erupted at the table, and a few heads turned, but no one spoke up. The waitress at the counter hesitated, pressing her lips into a thin line before she busied herself wiping an already clean surface. Lorraine could see it in their expressions. Nobody wanted trouble, not with a group like this. Daniel, however, remained completely still, slowly sipping his coffee and setting the mug down with steady precision. If the remarks bothered him, he didn't show it. That was the thing about her father. He had endured worse. He had lived through far more challenging situations. But Lorraine wasn't as patient. Her jaw tightened as she exhaled through her nose, forcing herself to stay composed. She reached for the syrup, drizzling it over her pancakes, moving carefully as if that would quell the heat rising in her chest. The bikers weren't done. Bet she even has to cut his steak for him. Another voice chimed in. Damn shame, huh? Tough guy like that reduced to a charity case. Something inside Lorraine snapped. Before she could stop herself, her fork clattered against the plate, and she turned her head just enough to meet the biker's gaze. He was grinning, his teeth stained yellow from too many cigarettes, his arms adorned with faded tattoos. The way he leaned forward, elbow propped on the table, made it clear he didn't expect her to respond. But she did. Are you done? She asked, her voice calm and steady. The grin widened. Oh, she talks. What's the matter, sweetheart? Upset? Just making conversation. Lorraine tilted her head slightly. Well, here's some conversation for you. Shut your mouth. The laughter at the table faltered for just a moment. One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy with a patchy beard, let out a low whistle. Feisty one. Lorraine. Daniel finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. She clenched her fists under the table, knowing that tone, knowing what it meant. Let it go. Don't waste your breath. But then the first biker, the loudest one, laughed again, shaking his head. Man, look at that, raised a little guard dog. That was it. Lorraine pulled out her phone. The bikers chuckled. Oh, what now? One of them sneered. Calling the cops? She didn't reply. She simply pressed one number and put the phone to her ear. Suddenly, the room began to pay attention. The bikers were still laughing, but something had shifted. They had no idea what was coming. Lorraine held the phone to her ear, her expression unreadable. She didn't raise her voice, didn't look angry, didn't even acknowledge the bikers anymore. She just listened to the ringing on the other end. The lead biker, the one with the thick beard and stained teeth, leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Oh no, he mocked. She's serious. What's it going to be, sweetheart? You calling the sheriff? Maybe your boyfriend? You think that's going to scare us? Lorraine didn't react. She just waited. The other end of the line clicked, and a familiar, deep voice answered. She spoke calmly. Hey, it's me. I need a favor. She barely finished her sentence before the lead biker erupted in laughter. Oh, this is Rich, he said, nudging the guy next to him. She's got a call for backup. You hear that, boys? Someone's coming to save her. His amusement spread through the table. One of them let out a dramatic sigh. Better eat fast before we get ourselves into some real trouble. But the energy in the diner had altered. It wasn't just Lorraine and the bikers anymore. Other patrons had stopped eating, their gazes flicking between the group and Lorraine, their interest piqued by something beyond mere curiosity. The waitress near the counter glanced at the clock on the wall, as if she sensed something was about to unfold. Daniel, still sitting quietly, reached for his coffee again. Lorraine, he said, his voice calm. What are you doing? She hung up the phone, slipped it back into her pocket, and then met her father's gaze. Not that he could see it, but somehow he always knew when she was looking at him. I'm handling it, she said simply. The lead biker scoffed. You're handling it? He repeated, shaking his head. Girl, you don't know what kind of game you're playing. Lorraine didn't answer. She reached for a fork, cut into her pancakes, and took a bite. That threw them off. The laughter quieted just a bit, replaced by something else, confusion, annoyance, maybe even something closer to unease, though none would ever admit it. For the first time, the lead biker wasn't sure if he was in control of this conversation anymore. He straightened, rubbing a hand over his beard. You don't just get to... The bell above the diner door jingled. The bikers barely noticed, too focused on their performance to pay attention to another customer walking in. Then another entered, and one by one, men and women began to fill the space near the entrance. Some were in uniform, others weren't. Some wore old jackets, faded but well-kept, with patches sewn onto the sleeves. A few were younger, but most were older men in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, and every single one of them bore the same expression. Steady, cold, neither angry nor amused. The waitress at the counter exhaled slowly. The lead biker frowned, his confidence wavering for the first time. He glanced at the newcomers, then back at Lorraine. She simply took another bite of her food. That was when he realized these people weren't just random customers. They were here for a purpose. The laughter at the table had ceased entirely. For the first time, the bikers weren't so sure they wanted to remain there. The diner had transformed. Just moments ago, it had been the bikers' stage. Their voices had carried. Their laughter had been the loudest sound in the room. But now, there was something heavier in the air, something they couldn't quite identify, yet felt deep within their bones. The men and women who had entered weren't just there for breakfast. They moved with quiet precision, spreading out enough to be noticeable but not chaotic. A man with silver hair and a well-pressed Marine Corps jacket took a seat at the counter, nodding at the waitress as if this was just another Tuesday morning. Another woman in her 60s, with short-cropped hair and a navy patch on her sleeve, leaned against a wall near the jukebox. They weren't looking at the bikers. They were focused on Daniel. The lead biker's smirk wavered as his eyes darted between the newcomers. His fingers tapped against the table, as if he could drum away the shift in control. He wasn't laughing anymore. One of the newcomers, a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with rough, weathered hands, stepped forward. He wore a simple button-down shirt, but the scars on his knuckles and the way he carried himself told a different story. He stopped beside Daniel's booth, his gaze resting on the older man with a quiet kind of respect. "Briggs," he said. Daniel lifted his chin slightly. "Carter." Lorraine watched as the lead biker's confidence slipped another notch. Carter. That name alone held significance. She had heard her father mentioned before, back when she was younger, before everything changed. They had served together, fought in the same battles, lost friends in the same deserts, and now he was here for him. The lead biker cleared his throat, sitting up straighter in his seat. "What's all this?" he asked, forcing out a chuckle. "Some kind of reunion?" Carter turned his head, finally acknowledging the man for the first time. His expression didn't change, but the way he looked at him made the entire table shift uncomfortably. "Something like that," Carter said, his voice even. The younger biker, the one with the patchy beard, leaned forward, trying to regain some bravado that had slipped away. "Look, man, we were just messing around," he said. "Didn't mean anything by it." Carter didn't respond right away. He just studied the group, his gaze slow and deliberate. "You think it's funny?" he asked finally. The lead biker forced a smirk. "It was just talk." Carter tilted his head slightly. "You ever been shot at?" The question was so abrupt, so casual, that it sucked all the air out of the room. The biker hesitated. "What?" "You heard me." Carter didn't blink. "You ever sat in the sand with bullets kicking up dust next to your head? Ever held a friend while he bled out? Ever felt the ground shake under your feet and prayed to God you'd make it home?" The lead biker's mouth opened, then closed. Carter leaned in slightly. "No," he said. "Then maybe, just maybe, you should keep your mouth shut about things you don't understand." Silence enveloped the diner. Even the waitress had stopped moving, her coffee pot frozen mid-pour. Lorraine observed the lead biker's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. He wasn't accustomed to this. He was used to pushing people around, being the loudest voice in the room. But now he wasn't so sure what kind of room he had entered, and he was just beginning to realize he had made a mistake. The bikers had started the morning in control. Now, they were just hoping to leave without losing more than their pride. The lead biker sat frozen, gripping the edge of the table as if it might keep him steady. His companions, who had been so full of laughter just a moment ago, were silent. They weren't reaching for their drinks, nor were they cracking jokes. They were waiting, watching to see how this would unfold. Carter didn't move or break eye contact. He didn't have to. Lorraine had seen this before. Not with Carter, but with her father. The way certain men carried themselves, how they didn't have to raise their voices to command a room. It wasn't about size or strength. It was about presence. And right now, Carter had it all. The lead biker swallowed hard. "Look, man," he said, his voice quieter than before. "We didn't know." Carter blinked. "Didn't know what?" The biker hesitated. "Didn't know he was blind." Carter pressed on, his tone still calm. Didn't know she was his daughter? Didn't know you were running your mouth about a man who put his life on the line, so you could sit here and eat your damn eggs in peace. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Daniel shifted in his seat, setting his coffee down with a quiet clink. "It's fine," he said, his voice even. "They're just boys who don't understand what respect looks like." That hit harder than any insult. Lorraine saw in the way the biker flinched, his face twisting, as if unsure whether to be angry or ashamed. "Respect," Carter repeated, gesturing toward Daniel with a slight nod. "That man has it. You don't." The younger biker, who had been so eager to laugh moments ago, shifted uncomfortably. "All right, man," he muttered. "We get it." But Carter wasn't finished. He straightened, adjusting his jacket, then turned to the lead biker one last time. "You think you're tough because you roll into places like this and act like you own the room?" He shook his head. "You don't even know what tough looks like." The lead biker didn't respond. He just clenched his jaw, reached for his wallet, and tossed a few crumpled bills onto the table. "We were leaving anyway." Carter smirked, just barely. "Yeah," he said. "I bet you were." The bikers pushed back their chairs, standing up one by one. The younger one walked out first, practically tripping over his own feet in his haste to leave. The lead biker lingered just a moment longer, glancing toward Daniel before shaking his head and following the others outside. The bell above the door jingled as they departed, and just like that, the diner exhaled. The waitress let out a long sigh, muttering about damn time before picking up a coffee pot and heading toward another table as if nothing had happened. A truck driver at the counter shook his head, returning to his meal. Carter finally slid into the booth across from Daniel, resting his forearms on the table. "You all right, old man?" he asked. Daniel smirked. "Been called worse." Lorraine relaxed for the first time in what felt like ages, exhaling as she leaned back in her seat. Carter turned to her, nodding slightly. "Smart call." She shrugged. "I knew they'd listen to you." He chuckled. "You give me too much credit. They just weren't ready to deal with real men." Daniel lifted his coffee again, shaking his head. "Real men don't need to prove anything." Carter grinned. "Now that," he said, "is respect." The bikers had left the diner thinking they had walked away, but deep down, they knew they hadn't won anything. The low rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance, swallowed by the quiet hum of the highway. Inside the diner, things gradually returned to normal. Plates clinked, coffee poured, and conversations resumed, albeit with an air of shared understanding. Lorraine let out a slow breath, her hands finally unclenching beneath the table. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding her fists. She glanced at her father, who was still sipping his coffee as if nothing had transpired. He always had a way of remaining steady, even when everything around him felt like it was about to topple. Carter leaned back in the booth, stretching his arms across the seat. "So," he said, looking at Daniel, "you always let your daughter handle your fights for you?" Daniel smirked. "Seems like she did just fine." Lorraine rolled her eyes but smiled. "I figured I'd save you the trouble." Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "She's got your fire, that's for sure." Daniel nodded slightly. "She's had to." For a moment, the table fell silent. Not the awkward kind of silence that needed filling, but one that carried weight and understanding. Then Carter's expression turned a bit more serious. He rested his elbows on the table, fingers laced together. "You know, it never fails to amaze me," he said, "how loud cowards can be." Lorraine glanced toward the door, where the bikers had exited. "You think they'll come back?" Carter snorted. "Not a chance." They were all bark. The second they realized they weren't the biggest dogs in the room, they ran with their tails between their legs. Daniel set his coffee down. "It's not just them," he said. "There will always be people like that, those who think respect is something you demand instead of something you earn." Carter nodded. "Yeah, but every now and then they meet someone who reminds them otherwise." Lorraine reflected on that, considering how different the outcome could have been. Her father had spent his life fighting for a country that didn't always fight for him in return. Yet he never let it make him bitter. He never became the type of person who threw his weight around just to feel strong. Strength wasn't about that. It was about restraint, knowing when to stand firm, when to fight, and when to allow the lesson to speak for itself. The waitress walked by and set the check on the table. But before Lorraine could reach for it, Carter slid it toward himself. "Don't even think about it," he said, pulling out his wallet. Daniel chuckled. "Still trying to pay off an old debt?" "Something like that," Carter replied. As the waitress walked away, Lorraine looked at her father. "You ready to go?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, listening, then nodded. "Yeah, let's get out of here." Carter stood first, extending a hand to Daniel. Daniel reached forward, finding Carter's grip with practiced ease. It was a handshake, but not just any handshake. It carried years of history and brotherhood that time and distance couldn't erase. Lorraine stepped beside her father, gently touching his arm. He turned slightly toward her, his unspoken way of saying he was ready. As they walked toward the door, Carter called after them, "Hey, Lorraine." She turned back. He nodded toward her father. "You take care of that old man." She smirked. "Always." The bell jingled as they stepped outside. The air was cooler now, the sun dipping lower in the sky. Lorraine led her father toward the car, her grip steady on his arm. Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle. "You did good today," he said quietly. Lorraine smiled. "I learned from the best." He turned his head toward her, a slow grin forming on his face. "That's the only compliment I'm getting today, isn't it?" She laughed, shaking her head as she opened the car door for him. "Pretty much." As they pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the diner and its morning behind, Lorraine glanced in the rear-view mirror one last time. The lesson had been delivered. Respect had been restored, and those men, the ones who believed power lay in their numbers and their volume, had learned something today. Real strength doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to be genuine. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Those who truly understand what it means to be strong never have to prove it to anyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.